A $100 bill is flicked, drawing attention to its universal value. The narrator questions why the US dollar is accepted worldwide, even in remote villages and foreign markets. Various currencies like euros and Mexican pesos are mentioned as less desirable. People are shown fighting over the US dollar in different countries. The narrator lists common reasons people believe the dollar is strong: US economy, military, stock market. The narrator reveals these are not the true reasons for the dollar's dominance. A mysterious secret meeting in July 1974 is introduced as the real reason. The narrator explains that the public was unaware of this meeting for decades. A handshake deal in the desert is described made under threat of global collapse. The narrator claims this deal enslaved the world to the dollar. The narrator warns that the deal is now breaking, with consequences for ordinary people. Intro graphic plays. The petrodollar regime with grainy footage of oil fields. Historic footage of President Nixon is shown. Stock tickers are displayed crashing. Nick introduces himself as someone obsessed with the hidden gears of the global economy. Nick addresses viewers who feel their money buys less each year. Nick encourages viewers to subscribe and like the video. What? Nick walks to his whiteboard, preparing to explain history. What? Nick writes, 1971. The crime scene in red marker. Nick begins explaining the Bretton Woods Agreement. The US dollar is described as the world reserve currency backed by gold. Other countries are shown holding dollars, trusting them as good as gold. The US government is depicted overspending on war and social programs. More paper claims on gold are printed than actual gold exists. France discovers the imbalance and sends battleships to New York. French officials are shown loading gold bars onto ships. The US government panics as gold reserves dwindle. President Nixon appears on TV, announcing the suspension of dollar convertibility to gold. Nixon reassures the public. Your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow. Single. Nick reveals the suspension was not temporary. The dollar transforms overnight into a fiat currency backed only by faith. People lose faith in the dollar during the early 70s. Inflation surges, and the stock market crashes by 45%. The dollar enters freefall, causing widespread economic anxiety. The US faces an existential crisis over the future of its currency. Nick explains the risk of global dollar dumping and potential hyperinflation. The elites search for a new anchor for the dollar. Gold is no longer an option. They turn to black gold oil. Nick draws a crude oil barrel on the whiteboard. He writes 1974, the fix on the board. Nick describes the events as historical fact, not conspiracy. William Simon, US Treasury Secretary, is sent on a secret mission. Simon is introduced as a bond trader and financial shark. Simon flies to Saudi Arabia, a kingdom rich in oil but surrounded by enemies. Saudi Arabia is depicted as wealthy but insecure. The US prepares to make Saudi Arabia an irresistible offer. Nick sets up the moment of the deal. Simple, brutal, and brilliant. Anticipation builds for the details of the secret agreement. The stage is set for the handshake deal that will change global economics. A handshake between a US official and a Saudi royal, symbolizing the start of a major agreement. Stacks of oil barrels with US flags painted on them, representing the US promise to buy Saudi oil. US military equipment jets, tanks, and weapons being delivered to Saudi Arabia. Saudi royals standing confidently, protected by a shield labeled US security. A close-up of a contract with the words guaranteed security stamped in bold. Saudi officials counting stacks of US dollars from oil sales. A sign at an oil market. Oil priced in US dollars only. Rejected signs for other currencies. German marks, yen goldal, crossed out. Saudi officials purchasing large amounts of US Treasury bonds. A visual of US Treasury bonds being stacked in a Saudi vault. Nick draws a circular flowchart on a board connecting the US, Saudi Arabia, and the world. A scroll from the US to Saudi Arabia with weapons and protection. Arrows flow from Saudi Arabia to the world with oil. Arrows flow from the world to the US with goods like cars and electronics. Arrows flow from Saudi Arabia back to the US with profits buying US treasuries. Nick stands in front of the board, gesturing to the circular flowchart. Nick addresses the audience, introducing the concept of the petrodollar system. A thought bubble appears above Nick. How does this affect my mortgage? Nick emphasizes the importance of the petrodollar system for the last 50 years. A world map highlighting countries with little or no oil. Japan and Germany. Factories in Japan and Germany shown running but needing oil. Japanese businessmen looking at oil prices, frustrated by dollars-only signs. A Japanese factory producing Toyotas and PlayStations. Cargo ships loaded with Toyotas and PlayStations heading to the US. US consumers happily buying Toyotas and PlayStations. Japanese officials exchanging dollars for oil from Saudi Arabia. Saudi officials receiving dollars, smiling as they count the money. A visual of the US government printing more money. Conveyor belt with US dollars flowing out of a printing press. Nick leans into the camera, whispering conspiratorially to the audience. A montage of American families enjoying imported goods, cars, electronics, clothes. A US military parade showcasing the size and power of the military. A chart showing US military spending towering over other countries. A globe with arrows showing US influence spreading worldwide. Nick at the board, wiping a section clean to introduce a new topic. Nick writes the hidden cost in bold letters on the board. A split image. US bankers and elites celebrating, while workers look concerned. A graph showing the dollar's value staying high over time. Factory in the Rust Belt closing its doors. Workers leaving with boxes. A deserted Detroit street with abandoned factories and empty lots. Newspaper headline, Detroit collapses. A mathematical equation on a chalkboard, linking the petrodollar system to factory closures. A montage of shuttered factories across the American Midwest. Family looking worried at their bills, surrounded by imported goods. Credit card statement showing mounting debt. It's a map showing U.S. military bases near oil-rich regions. A shadowy figure labeled U.S. military threat looming over oil pipelines. A leader from another country attempting to break the oil-dollar deal, looking anxious. A warning sign, break the deal at your own risk. Nick stands solemnly, looking at the board as the weight of the system becomes clear. Photos of Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi flash on screen, then quickly disappear. Nick sits on the edge of a desk, looking serious and thoughtful. Nick begins to speak, referencing the timeline of oil and currency decisions. A visual timeline appears. Saddam Hussein in 2000 announces selling Iraqi oil in euros. A visual flash of the aftermath in Iraq, hinting at conflict and regime change. A visual timeline continues. Muammar Gaddafi in 2011 proposes a gold-backed Pan-African currency. Images of Clinton's leaked emails and intervention in Libya are referenced. A bold message appears. You use our paper, or you get our lead. Nick maintains a serious expression, emphasizing the consequences of challenging the dollar. Nick shifts in posture, reflecting on the impermanence of empires and secret treaties. Nick states that the petrodollar system is dying, with mainstream media ignoring the implications. A headline from the Wall Street Journal flashes, Saudi Arabia in talks to sell oil to China in yuan. A visual of the BRICS alliance expanding in 2024 to include Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Iran. Flags or symbols of BRICS countries are shown, highlighting their control over global oil and gas. A visual of these countries discussing trading in local currencies, bypassing the dollar. Nick explains the US weaponizing the dollar, referencing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A visual of $300 billion of Russian assets being seized by the US. Images of concerned leaders in China, Saudi Arabia, and India reacting to the asset seizure. A thought bubble appears. If I disagree with American policy, my money isn't safe. Nick declares that global trust in the dollar is gone. Nick stands up and starts pacing, contemplating the consequences of the treaty breaking. A visual representation of the Trifon dilemma begins to play out. A flood of dollars is depicted returning to the US from overseas accounts and central banks. A graph appears showing massive supply of dollars meeting domestic demand. Nick explains how inflation could spiral beyond the Fed's control. A visual of rising prices, gas, electronics, and imports becoming unaffordable. A depiction of the US losing its exorbitant privilege of printing money. A scenario is shown where the government must balance its budget or print money rapidly. A hyperinflationary spiral is depicted with rapidly increasing prices and chaos. Nick draws a graph on the board, one line for debt, one for GDP diverging wildly. Nick addresses skepticism, referencing the arrogance that destroys empires. Visuals of gold bars, commodities, Bitcoin, and baskets of currencies appear. Central banks are shown buying gold in record amounts in 2022 and 2023. Nick emphasizes that the world is preparing for a post-dollar era. Nick looks directly at the camera, intensely challenging viewers. A visual timeline of financial history. British pound as reserve currency, then its decline. Dutch guilders shown as world reserve currency, then losing its status. The dollar's 50-year run based on a secret deal with Saudi Arabia is depicted. A visual of the deal ending with Saudi Arabia moving away from the dollar. Nick asks how viewers can protect themselves as the dollar loses its monopoly. Step 1 appears. Accept the paradigm shift. A melting ice cube represents the dollar losing value, freezer door left open. Step 2 appears. Follow the central banks. Visual of China, Russia, and India buying gold, contrasted with individuals not buying. Physical gold is depicted as a stable, enduring asset. Step 3 appears. Understand digital scarcity. Bitcoin is shown as a neutral bearer asset, outside petrodollar banking rails. Saudis and Chinese are depicted trading with a neutral ledger, gold or crypto. Step 4 appears. Get out of debt. A warning visual. Variable rate debt, adjustable rate mortgages, and credit card debt. Nick picks up a $100 bill and holds a lighter to its corner, flame hovering but not burning. Nick explains the secret treaty of 1974. America, living on borrowed time. A visual of a credit card with no limit, representing America's financial privilege. The bill comes due. The world is moving on, with the global South tired of funding the U.S. lifestyle. Nick presents 3 choices: anger, ignorance, or preparation. A transition is depicted from a unipolar to multipolar world, with volatility and expense. Wealth transfer is shown. Those holding dying currency lose, those with real assets gain. A final warning: don't be left holding worthless paper when the music stops. Nick introduces himself, stating he watches the markets for viewers. Nick urges viewers to prepare for the next decade, ending with a determined expression.